So the tricky thing about teaching creative writing is that it's creative. I can tell you about what has worked for me, I can tell you about things I've seen in fiction that don't seem to work well, I can talk about the elements that a lot of good fiction have in common, but it isn't math. There isn't only one right answer. There may be a lot of wrong answers, but even those are sometimes debatable. We obviously shouldn't all do it the same way, because then, as I discussed last lecture, it stops being self-expression and it becomes a formula to plug in for. At the end of the day, your craft is your craft. You have to develop your own writing habits, your own style, your own voice, and even your own philosophy. What I'm delivering in this course is my own personal way of looking at writing and the writing life. In college, I had a number of writing instructors in different mediums, and they all had their own philosophies and methods. They were all influential in helping me to develop my own, but mine is not exactly like any of theirs. I had one professor who insisted that you should start with theme and draw your characters from that you have to know what your story is before you write it, and that every line of dialogue must be subtextually layered and speak to that thematic agenda. I passionately disagreed with that approach and fought her tooth and nail, but she had wonderful advice on voice and imagery, and she had the best workshopping practices of any professor I worked with. The professor whose ideas most closely reflect my own now wasn't, in my opinion, strict enough about point of view. He was too okay with a 20-page short story jumping around from head to head, which has rarely worked in anything I've read, and he often said children are inherently sympathetic, which I believe is true in real life in a way it absolutely is not in fiction. Call me a monster, but I wanted the little girl in Spielberg's War of the Worlds to die in the worst way. So take every idea and piece of advice you get from anyone with your prose with a grain of salt. Use what works for you and disregard what doesn't. And most importantly, allow your writing to develop naturally. Don't be discouraged if the first thing you write isn't well received or doesn't come out the way you hoped. That's a valuable experience because as you peel away the things that don't work, you'll start to refine the things that do. It's difficult, but you have to keep two separate but linked brains about your writing. Use your analytical and critical brain as you digest other writers' work and you study writing theory. Then, put all of that away as you sit down to write your own work and allow yourself to evolve gradually and organically, and use your writing brain. Don't think about the process while you're doing the work. Don't gum up your mind with how the sausage is made. Just make the sausage and then see later, in revision, if it seems to taste okay. Sausage can't be improved on after it's been processed and cooked. It's either delicious or it's disgusting. But writing can and should be improved. The first draft is the foundation you build on. That's where a lot of the real work happens. Don't think of the blank page as the canvas. Think of the first draft as the canvas. The words you first put down are your paints, just arranged in some kind of organized fashion. If you can allow yourself to have an out-of-body experience when you write, to not be self-critical of every word and idea as you're going along, to not worry if it's good until you've finished with it, you'll make all the mistakes you need to get out of your system as you stumble and fumble for what you're after. If it must be perfect first time out, you'll often just impede your own progress. Sometimes it goes better than others. You may get a draft you don't have to change too much, and it's wonderful when that happens. But you have to sin boldly, and only think about what you've learned from classes you take, books you read, and workshops afterwards, and trust that lessons sink in on their own. Be willing to make mistakes. A first draft is a clearing of the throat. If you let the phlegm stay in your throat, your words are never going to come out the way you want them to. I say all of that to say this. I don't want you to be bogged down with rules and advice while you're creating. Consider these things as you critique other pieces and when you look at your own retroactively, but please don't let these things intimidate you as you stare at the blank page. The hardest part of the process for most people is just getting started. And that's because the blank page is less than a canvas for a writer. You have to produce the tools yourself. But unlike a painter, or any writer before the advent of the word processor, once you put something down, you can move it, change it, scrap it, or add to it. I guess digital drawing is sort of like that now too, but I'm getting away from the point I'm trying to make. Until you choose to show your work to someone else, it's just you and the page. No one needs to know if it takes you a full hour to write down 50 words, or if you think everything you're putting down is garbage. Don't be afraid to spit all over the page, because even if just one idea or phrase or image comes from the refuse that sparks inspiration, it was worth your time and frustration. And that leads me to my first principle of beginning writing. Number 1, you probably will have to write a lot of crap before you write anything good. I pretty much went over this with my last point. Mistakes are useful. Don't be afraid to make them. A lot of the real work happens in revision. And improving your writing is a never-ending process that happens by writing a lot and letting refinements happen on their own. Read, listen, write, then repeat. Number 2, no one gives a flying fish about your story. The most disillusioning attitude you can have is that your story or idea is brilliant, and that whoever is reading will hang on to your every word because they're so excited to be there in the first place. Nope. Readers have a lot of options, and there are a million other ways they can get a good story now rather than reading. It's sad to say, but it's a bigger commitment, especially these days, to ask someone to read your story than to watch your movie or play your video game. And your audience is a lot more likely to put your prose down if it doesn't immediately grab their attention. Reading is a very active experience, and you have to make it as effortless as possible for your reader to do his share of the work. I'm not suggesting you employ cheap gimmicks or insult your audience's intelligence. Just remember that you aren't entitled to your reader's attention. Keep perspective, and remember that your reader doesn't know you or understand the intent of your piece any further than what you present in your story. First lines are important. The first full page is imperative. Your reader may come for a concept, but he'll stay for the execution. Number 3, you can make anything work, you just have to make it work. If you've ever listened to an episode of Superhero Rewind, you've probably heard me say that before, and you'll hear it a billion more times in this course. It may sound, I realize, a little hyperbolic. It doesn't apply to some ridiculous specific ideas, like, say, a plumber with bacon for hands, living in Tudor England during Elizabeth's reign, speaking only Portuguese, and riding a purple horse with bat wings. Probably can't be done, but maybe. What that means is that execution trumps concept. Much of the time, it isn't an idea that's to blame when it doesn't resonate with an audience, but the implementation. The cliché that truth is stranger than fiction often rings true. It doesn't matter if something wild or dangerous or bizarre really happened to you that you put in your story and your reader isn't believing it. If you don't sell it right, we may not buy it. And sometimes it just takes a lot of trial and error to land on the presentation that proves believable. Finally, number 4, as I said last video, know the rules before you break them. That doesn't mean you have to read everything written about fiction writing or the English language before you write a story. It just means that if you know of a modern convention you want to break, it's smarter to drive in your lane before you decide to veer into oncoming traffic. Start simple, and don't get too ambitious before you've had some experience. Try some short fiction to hone your craft before you write War and Peace in Space. Write about someone doing a job you've done before you try a period piece about cab drivers in the 1960s. If you're a guy, work within the perspective you know best and try a male perspective before you get adventurous and write about a female protagonist. Again, I don't mean to say you should handcuff yourself and you should never get outside your comfort zone, only that it's good to know your limitations and work toward eliminating them, rather than assuming that because you can imagine it now, you have the tools to realize it now. I'll talk about all these principles at length and frequently throughout these lectures. In the meantime, remember, once you sit down to create your protagonist and your world, let yourself go if you can. And think about this stuff before and after, but not during. Your prose will be best when you feel like you're reading it as you write it. Next time, I'll discuss workshopping, why we're doing that, and what, hopefully, it can do to help you hone your craft. Happy writing, everybody.